Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to be here today again to speak on behalf of residents of Simcoe North and represent their views, but also to discuss a very important issue with respect to what potentially we believe is anti-competitive behaviour in Canada's e-transfer ecosystem. We learned these revelations became known to us at Industry Committee a couple weeks ago. The facts are these. It is clear that Interac uses what they call, and what they've confirmed, volume-based pricing. As we just heard, my very capable colleague from Calgary Nose Hill outline how the system works. But here are the facts as I understand them. The largest financial institutions in the country pay Interac 6 cents to send an e-transfer. The smallest financial institutions in the country pay Interac 43 cents a transaction to send an e-transfer. That's a 7 times difference. Now, in theory, volume-based discounts aren't a bad thing. A lot of people and a lot of Canadians shop at Costco. When you walk out of there with 5 boxes of Cheerios when you really only need 1, but it's because you get a volume discount. So there's nothing inherently wrong with volume discounts until you learn that Interac is owned by the banks. So the financial institutions set the prices that Interac charges other financial institutions, and surprise, surprise, they've favored themselves. These governance issues at Interac, by the way, the ownership structure is completely secret, hidden from all in plain sight. We have no idea who owns what the compensation structure is for Interac executives, what the compensation is for board members. But it gets worse. At the time that Interac developed its fee schedule, Interac was co-chaired on the board by 2 financial institutions. These 2 financial institutions were the largest in Canada at the time, and the only 2 financial institutions that met the required volume threshold to get the lowest price. Conflict of interest? Likely. We know that conflicts of interest, and we understand that members of the government have a challenge understanding what a conflict of interest is, so we'll explain it briefly. Conflict of interest exists whether there's an actual or perceived conflict of interest. It doesn't actually have to be a bona fide conflict of interest. A conflict of interest can exist when a reasonable person perceives there to be a conflict. Well, Mr. Speaker, it would appear to me very clearly that a reasonable person walking down the street would say, geez, that doesn't sound right. The big banks get to set the pricing that smaller banks pay to compete with the big banks to send an e-transfer. Now, yes, it's true, many Canadians don't pay for e-transfers, but many Canadians actually do pay. They can pay up to $1.50 per transaction. But if they bank at a big bank, the big bank pays Interac only 6 cents. That's a heck of a gross profit margin. I don't care how much fraud is in the system, Mr. Speaker. When you pay 6 cents variable cost to send an e-transfer and you make $1.50 in revenue, oh, by the way, the receiving bank sometimes charges the person receiving the transfer for that transaction in their bank account up to $1.50. When the small institutions are trying to compete with the big ones, they're offering free e-transfers, but they have to pay 43 cents. So they have to make up those 43 cents of revenue somewhere else just to offer that fee or that free banking service to its clients. In fact, I have a low, no-cost banking account at one of these upstarts solely because it's free checks and free e-transfers. But a lot of Canadians don't have the time and the effort or the means to shop around. The solution here, Mr. Speaker, is a lot more transparency, of course. But perhaps we could consider even other possibilities. And let's be very clear, I'm not talking about Interac itself, I'm talking about its owners, the dark Sith overlord owners called the banks. They are the ones that are pulling the strings like the puppets at Interac. So it's not Interac itself that has a problem, it's the influence, the undue influence of the owners. And so maybe we should think about freeing Interac from the shackles of the big banks. They would have to then deal with the big banks on an arm's length basis. We could also think about supporting a competitor to Interac, which would give people choice. That is a very radical position, Mr. Speaker, but I think it would bring integrity back to the system. I'm not saying we absolutely should do it, but the time has come to really consider all of the options. We should be unburdened by the past. We have to turn the page, Mr. Speaker. We can't go back to where these large oligopoly companies have undue influence and control. I swear the banks must think some of us just fell out of a coconut tree with the practices that they use. But the answer to this is more competition. The answer to this problem is to give more choice to consumers, but choice to financial institutions on how to move money throughout the system. Canadians, businesses, and individuals spend about $3 to $5 billion a year in transaction fees to move money across the country. This is a significant profit pool for financial institutions and people in the payment space, companies in the payment space. And it's competition that will reduce the size of that profit pool so that consumers can benefit, to leave more money in their pockets. I recognize that many people in this place have differing views on how we might achieve lower prices for Canadians. My own personal opinion is that lower prices will not be achieved by increasing the size of revenues for government. There is no correlation between increasing taxes on companies and lowering prices for Canadians. The idea is we must attack these profit pools with competition. In fact, a Deloitte study suggested that up to 0.5% to 0.8% of GDP could be unlocked of value for Canadians if we moved forward with payments modernization. The Bank of Canada has a role to play too. They set up standards that prominent payment systems must comply with. Well, guess what? Interac is in non-compliance with two of those standards, namely that they use volume-based pricing, not risk-based pricing, but also it is not public on how one becomes a member of Interac. Now, the Department of Justice in the United States has gone after its prominent payment system, Visa, for its practices at Interac that it uses in the United States. That entity controls 60% of the e-transfer debit market, the debit market in the U.S. Interac controls like 95% of the debit market in Canada and 100% of the e-transfer market in Canada. So I would encourage regulators to look at those or at that example. It is clear that the status quo will not work anymore. A wise man once said, "Don't moon the gorilla." Well, the gorilla is mooning us Canadians and laughing all the way to the bank because they are fleecing Canadians. A great new book came out called Fleeced by Andrew Spence. I would encourage everybody in this chamber to read it.